All the world's a stage. Unmasking Asperger Syndrome, or Autism Spectrum Disorder, or High-Functioning Autism, or whatever it is they're calling it. I tend to be a little long-winded, by David Serpa. Dedication. This book is dedicated to the imprudent, the autistic advocates, influencers, and activists. Introduction. All the world's a stage. What are you passionate about? I'm passionate about that the things that I do are going to make the world a better place. Temple Grandin. At the heart of when I started this book, I really just wanted to make the world a better place and help others to find the same understanding that I have begun to experience with myself. I hope this comes through in the pages. I also had a great deal of fun writing, researching, and editing All the World's a Stage, Unmasking Asperger Syndrome, or Autism Spectrum Disorder, or High-Functioning Autism, or whatever it is they're calling it. I tend to be a little long-winded. I wanted this book to be something different than the pain-inducing sludge through the mush that comes with many books about those living with autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, I hope to reach those undiagnosed or recently diagnosed and help to add some order to this disorder. There are a lot of preconceived notions about what autism is and what it isn't. Unfortunately, the perpetuation of false information has kept many from getting the help that they need to understand themselves. A diagnosis of autism doesn't suddenly mean that you will become a ward of the state or be fired from your job or lose custody of your children. It may just give you the guidebook that you have needed your whole life to understand you. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful start? The information I have compiled in this book helped me to find my way out of the woods. I was depressed, bordering on suicidal, but pushing onward with the hope of finding the answers that I was looking for. As a Marine Corps combat veteran, I spent time in a VA hospital where I went in wondering what was wrong with me and came out with a list of things and a bag full of medication. But the diagnosis didn't fit. They threw several at me during my short stay there, though none came from a provider or a doctor. The medical student there in a wing on a 3-day observation thought I might be bipolar based on a 15-minute conversation and my willing to answer any questions and talk about anything, including sex. Then the doctor, who I saw for the first time on my way out, suggested narcissism. How could I be a narcissist when I hate myself so much? I left feeling further isolated. I am a debater, or an ENTP. This is my Myers-Briggs personality profile. This means I am very comfortable telling people where they are wrong. And I can eloquently explain to them why. I stood up to the VA at my last checkup after I had out-processed, and I told them how broken their system is. I explained to them rationally and calmly the downfalls of care within their facility. She received the information warmly and told me I am exactly the kind of person they need down there advocating for change. This frustrated me. The problems were clear to everyone that worked there. The system is broken, and they wanted me to come down unpaid and address the broken bureaucracy that is burying veterans because I can express myself eloquently. There is no shortage of frustrated veterans working within the system, and plenty of others not even daring to try to get started because they know that the help that they are looking for isn't there. It is a shame that the people will not get the help that they need because they will not be received by the people that are supposed to be providing it. This is the same issue that people with autism spectrum disorder and many of their caretakers are facing. It is a scary issue because so many people are silently struggling, wondering what is wrong with them, but they don't have the ability to place these thoughts into words in a way that they will be received. So they keep their masks on and the world out. There's a reason I decided to call this book Unmasking Asperger Syndrome. The mask is so well crafted, such an amazing coping mechanism that many of us don't realize we are wearing it. We just feel a disconnect from the world we are living in. I often feel like there are two of me, the person I am presenting to the world and the inner me. I keep the two worlds separate like Clark Kent and Superman. I have always been very careful not to show the world all of me. Historically, people don't stick around when they realize I don't like to go out to the movies, into bars, or other social events, but would rather sit around a fire pit in the backyard. I have also been called a lot to handle, or too much, by many of the people I have loved and that have loved me. I am somewhat burdensome for people to keep around for a long period of time. I don't say this out of a sense of self-pity, but in a need for transparency. The realization that no one was coming to save me was a freeing one. I had to put on my cape and save myself. I decided I was all in. I would go on the journey and follow the pain wherever it led. I journeyed inward, outward, and everywhere in between looking for answers. I started conducting an autopsy on the corpse of my life, seeking to understand. The year prior to my discovery that I had autism spectrum disorder was the hardest of my life. I sought the deep answers at the tail end of years spent in therapy, read books, consulted with mystics, talked to my family, and found patterns and answers in the strangest of places. It didn't help that I had been to combat a few years prior, saw my fair share, and then buried myself into a transition into a career in real estate after getting out of the Marine Corps. In a few short years, I'd lost a friend to combat, another to suicide, lost my father-in-law to cancer, went through a divorce, lost my routines, my career derailed, and I lost my sense of self. The walls I had been creating my entire life to keep the world out came down crashing around me. It was harder than ever to focus. The usual schedule that I kept seemed impossible for me to keep up with. The shifting of custody schedules, new jobs, and a shattered self-image left it hard for me to find my feet on solid ground. Tragedy had set in, and I felt at the time it was masking the real problem, but it was actually guiding me to it. Autistic people experience grief differently than neurotypical people. As I would later find in the article, Autistic Grief is Not Like Neurotypical Grief by Carla Fisher. The boy I had inside of me was out in full force. The scared boy I had inside of me was out in full force. I have always been a tremendous problem solver, but the problems stacked up and seemed insurmountable. I could not reason my way out of the situation I was in. I started to reasonably consider suicide. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I believe if you can't fight your demons, you pass them on to your children. I couldn't understand or locate my demons. I was understandably frustrated. How can you fight something that you can't define? I didn't want to be remembered as a ticking time bomb or the cold and distant father living my life in the other room. I wanted to set a precedence and break a pattern. I set out to hack my life's algorithm and understand me. After a lifetime spent on the outskirts of every group I belonged to, I felt the distance between me and the rest of humanity growing ever larger. I hated almost every job I had ever had a string of broken relationships, never had any real significant or lasting relationships, and now I was a divorced father. I was the common denominator in all of my problems. With radical acceptance for my life and my role in it, I felt more at the helm of my problems and less like they were something that was happening to me. The problem felt internal, and I wanted it gone. Through a long series of events, I discovered post-traumatic growth and the PATH program in Arizona. They introduced me to the concept that we could be better men or women than the ones that went through trauma. While in Arizona, I really got the ball rolling in the right direction. I started piecing together my story and started detaching from it. I wish I could say I came back and immediately everything was better, but I still hadn't found that missing puzzle piece. I still hadn't realized I was on the autism spectrum. I got into a peaceful place with my therapy after 4 years and 2 different therapists, and I could honestly say I was in a good place. I had gotten as far as therapy could take me, which was good because I could no longer afford my therapy sessions. So I pulled off the Band-Aid and started searching for the answers on my own. This seemed like the next logical step in my healing anyway, and I was excited to take extreme ownership of my situation. I have always been fascinated with finding patterns in people, relationships, religion, and politics, and I started looking for patterns in my life. I was 33 years old and alone. All of my relationships with my work colleagues, my friendships, and my personal relationships naturally came to an end or faded off into the distance. I was the common denominator in all of my relationship problems, but this thought had never occurred to me. I took the time to read, study, and follow the rabbit hole as deeply as it would go. I had a podcast entitled It's About More Than Real Estate, where I would interview top producing real estate agents about their life stories, businesses, and relationships, and they would set out to hack the algorithms of life. I looked back at my life story and set out to understand it for myself. I decided I would tell my story. I had to look back and consider everything, every insult, every whisper, any harsh word from a peer, a coworker, a spouse, a parent, or a teacher, I tried on like a glove. I took nothing personally. I set out like an indifferent scientist. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. I started with where I would start with any member of my team. I read and studied my Myers-Briggs personality profile. I was now hacking my life. I tested as an ENTP, a debater, or an inventor. I took time to read the biographies of people with similar designs, and I learned that they struggled with interpersonal relationships, but were often revered from afar. They also had a somewhat heartbreaking tendency of dying alone and on foreign soil. Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and many others I admire were Promethean in nature, excited to push science forward for the sake of science, with a tendency to be alienated and demonized. Both of them died alone on foreign soil, Albert with an unfinished algorithm at his hand, and Nikola on borrowed money in a rented room. During the time of my study, Atypical was released on Netflix, and got my attention. In the same way that I had felt connected to Parenthood and the autism subplot, I was connected to every piece of Atypical. I binge watched the series, and I am anxiously awaiting the next season. For someone that sees television as a massive waste of time, this is unusual for me. Similarities between me and this awkward dude walking around the halls of his high school, writing down rules for social interaction in a notebook while maintaining unusual interest. This series had come along at the perfect time for me and gave me a break from the heavy reading I was doing and started me towards feeling more bonded to the autism community than ever. I started looking at similarities between PTSD and autism. I realized that many of the issues I was having were longer lasting in my life. They seemed to come back like a flood whenever I was experiencing a time of tragedy or a time of transition or something else that made my life more difficult. My digestive issues, my inability to sleep, the need to be insulated from the world around me were trademarks for certain times of my life. I dove headfirst into my understanding of trauma, pain, war, and business. I read every book that was recommended to me. I studied every social or personality disorder that I'd ever been accused of having, and I found heroes everywhere, shining beacons of light, helping others find their ways into themselves or the people that they love. I found therapists, doctors, and as well as individuals speaking on their personal stories and sharing them with others, and compiling information in useful ways that I was able to consume. There's more courage on YouTube at the moment than there are in most wars that are happening in the world. I'm not saying it doesn't take courage to go to war. I am saying it takes a tremendous amount of courage to send out your bipolar disorder, narcissism, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, or autism spectrum disorder on social media, and then offer advice for others on how to deal with it. Everyone is a critic, but there are very few that stand in the arena and open themselves up to criticism. It takes a great deal of courage to be the dissenting voice of reason in a world gone mad. It also takes an incredible amount of courage to go on the record and risk being wrong. In the book Thinking in Pictures by Temple Grandin, she incorrectly makes the hypothesis that every autistic person thinks in pictures. Do you know who is the first person to bring up that criticism? Temple Grandin. This sort of commitment to the truth and willingness to be wrong is where I found my heroes in 2018. The authors, the bloggers, the YouTubers, the people out there pushing thought forward for the sake of others. When I think of Temple Grandin and others in the autistic community advocating on behalf of their own, Theodore Roosevelt's speech, The Man in the Arena, comes to mind. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out when the strong man stumbles, or how the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, but there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end of the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be known with those cold and timid souls who know victory nor defeat. It is the St. Crispin's Day speech written by William Shakespeare. It is The Man in the Arena by Theodore Roosevelt. It is If by Rudyard Kipling. I will not be in the position at the end of my life to hold my manhood cheap because I missed the fight. I am here in the trenches with all of you. I will not stand above anyone, toting degrees or quoting the newest version of the DSM. I don't even have the golden diagnosis or all of the answers for everyone in one book. I am self-diagnosed Aspergian, and I don't even know how to say Asperger's correctly. But I will be happy to key you into all my studies and hopefully help you to get a better understanding of yourself or a loved one. Why? Because others did it for me without ever having met me in my life. That means something to me. I found my heroes on YouTube in 2018 in the arena of social media, pushing thought forward, confronting toxic thought, and opening themselves up to the harshest critics in the world, the anonymous YouTube subscriber or Facebook user leaving comments. This book is not the DSM-5, nor is it trying to be. I know there's more information on YouTube blogs in the digital library in the palm of my hand than they could ever hope to compile in any university in the world. How about them apples? Information is ripe for the picking, and I pick it regularly. I consumed everything, and I started dipping my toes into every accusation of a mental disorder that I'd ever received. I will mention Steve Silberman's book, Neurotribe, several times, and this story in particular, again later. I found this book after writing a significant portion of Unmasking Asperger Syndrome, and it opened my eyes on so many levels. It is everything that this book will never be, and that is okay. Silberman writes about a story of Goodman, a young ham operator, who reads stories of amateur ham operators relaying messages that they could help in rescue missions half the world away. They were able to accomplish these feats based on their ability to communicate with ham radio operators, or ham radios. Reading about the adventures, he writes, of these young heroes, Goodman became determined to join their ranks. Soon, he had built a rig and earned his FCC license, but communicating by wireless could not provide all of the support and guidance he needed. He would spend the next several decades flunking out of school, losing jobs, going in and out of psychiatric institutions, and struggling to survive on disability. He eventually sought help from more than 20 psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists. But until the scope of the autism diagnosis was broadened to include adults, they couldn't make sense of the challenges that he was facing. Finally, at age 70, Goodman was able to get the diagnosis and access to the services that he needed. Joining a support group for adults run by the Asperger's Association of New England, he says, was like coming ashore after a life of bobbing up and down on a sea that seemed to stretch in infinity in all directions. Those of us with autism spectrum disorder know what it feels like to be bobbing up and down at sea. There are times I feel isolated around people because of my inability to communicate or my difficulty having a conversation in a loud coffee shop. But now I give myself grace. Now I have understanding, and that means everything. The conversations I had with family members during the writing of this book helped me to recall some of the darker corners, as well as illuminate some of the amazing stories and achievements of my family. I began looking at everyone with different lenses. I had extreme pride for my grandpa's achievements at IBM in the Silicon Valley. I was proud to be raised by him. My profoundly self-educated grandmother, who revered me as such a clever little guy or such a special little guy, and my mother, who worked with adults with disabilities for over 20 years. I was also led to great compassion for my father, who was adopted when he was young. My grandma, who sought answers for my dad and remembers a therapist recalling that some people are just wired wrong. My dad was distant, and the smallest sounds, oh goodness gracious. I lost my connection here. Give me just a moment. Let me see if I can pull it up on here. Okay. If you guys hang in there with me for just a moment, I'm going to pull it back up. This is what happens when we go live. And I've already got the book pulled up here. Okay, thank you guys for hanging in there. Okay, so as I was saying, about my dad. After a lifetime of spinning out the outskirts of every group that I belonged to, I got to a peaceful place with my therapy. My podcast, the series Atypical, we talked about PTSD and autism, me diving head first. Everyone is a critic, the man in the arena, the DSM-5. This book is not the DSM-5. Goodman and Neurotribes, bobbing up and down in sea, me looking at my family, and here we are, holy Moses, we made it back. I was also led to a great compassion for my father, who was adopted when he was young. And my grandmother, who sought answers for my dad with a therapist, remembers recalling that some people are just wired wrong. My dad was distant and the smallest sound could set him off. But I have no doubt now that he loved me in the best way that he could. He isolated himself with his dogs and his deep passion for physical fitness and ultra running. My childhood was tumultuous at best, and my infrequent moving and turbulent home life made it difficult for teachers and therapists to get a consistent read on me. My mom worked 3 jobs through much of my childhood, and I was alone through much of my childhood as I was with my 2 young sisters, and I was watching after them from a very young age. My parents' relationship, the moves, and other childhood issues made autism spectrum disorder hide behind trauma in the 1990s when the knowledge was not where it needed to be in our new home in the Sierra Nevadas as we left the Silicon Valley behind. I developed my mask to be the rock that I needed to be for my mom and for my sisters. Lacking a consistent role model or father figure, my infatuation with superheroes kept me connected to an image to uphold. I felt bonded to the necessity to keep people at a distance, and I understood the feeling of being dropped off at the wrong planet. But wanting to serve everyone around me, I continued trying to be Captain America, never doing anything wrong, and always being a force for good. I started taking on bullies from a very young age in my childhood and into adulthood. My mom would tell me, son, you don't have an S on your chest. I continued to be what I needed to be, the shining example of what a Marine could be, what a real estate agent could be, a father, a husband, a son, and so forth, until I could no longer be anything for anyone. Finding the talk by Professor Tony Attwood entitled Could It Be Asperger's was the first time I felt like anyone had described me or could understand what I was going through. Listening to Amethyst Shaber's Ask an Autistic series gave me hope, helped me bury the shame, and gave me a deeper understanding of what autism is and what it is not. I've also come to understand by her example the importance of autistic advocates that are also autistic, being a part of advocacy groups. They say nothing about us without us. While Paul from Asperger's from the Inside made me relate to his day-to-day scenarios, handling isolation and the breakdown complex issues in a way that I could understand. All of these people have channels where they are deeply vulnerable, honest, and transparent in their quest to help other people while seeking answers for themselves. Unmasking Asperger Syndrome is a collection of the thoughts and perspectives of many of my heroes that got me through my darkest nights, some of my own insights, and all of the ways that I have learned about my autism, and can hopefully offer you insight into some of yours. There are quotes from other books on autism, blogs, TED Talks, and YouTube videos. And if I quoted the DSM even one time, it was an accident. I would rather cite the people in the trenches than spend a fraction of a second citing the people whose opinions are secondhand, stale, and recycled. We are entering an era of self-help, and we don't need to wait to be saved. With the previous limited diagnosis criteria for adults living with autism spectrum disorder to be diagnosed as such, and the desire for it to be painted as a rare disease, means that there are generations of undiagnosed people living with ASD out there in the world, doing the best that they can, what they have. And many are finding their way just fine. From our parents' generation and the ones before that, there were a lot of people that were prevented from seeking help because they didn't want to be defined as having a mental illness. Many others just lived with the condition and it never bothered or disrupted their routines. I am not particularly interested in the diagnosis criteria for autism spectrum disorder or how to seek a diagnosis. I'm not going to break down services or discuss how to receive access to them. I am sure there are great books out there for these things. This book isn't going to be all things for all people, but I believe it could help a number of people, and it could help parents, educators, and adults that are curious if they, a loved one, might be on the spectrum. Others, it might just help them to understand what the autism spectrum is. I hope I am able to guide you on a roadmap to understanding that helped me tremendously. I went undiagnosed for over 30 years. Technically, I still am. I don't necessarily believe that this is a bad thing. I don't believe I would have accomplished everything I have accomplished with a disorder hanging over my head. I don't believe that adults around me would have allowed me to experience the freedom that I have experienced. Times are changing, and people are shattering the baseline of what is expected from autistic people. And services are becoming more available with awareness. I want to be the adult that I wish I had growing up, the one that saw me for the wonderful little weirdo that I was, just trying to piece together the world. I am writing this book to help people like me, the people that wear the mask so well that very few people can see that they are struggling, the ones that have learned to live with the expectations of our peer groups, people that don't look autistic because, after all, what does autism look like? What happens to those young Caucasian boys that were rocking on the carpet? I don't like to call it autism spectrum disorder. Psychology has always proved to be a cold bastard, perpetuating negative self-images and over-reliance on therapy and medication. The industry's existence is reliant on keeping people in a constant state of seeking answers instead of finding them, in a constant state of feeling incapable or incompetent. We are led to believe we have no ability to understand our wiring and adapt to it without the use of heavy medications or an aid. I relate much more of the teachings and findings to Hans Asperger's and his clinic in Austria than I do to what psychology is now in America. I relate to him. The DSM can keep autism spectrum disorder. I will proudly identify as an Aspie. Besides, maybe if we spent less time calling things disorders and spent more time looking at abilities as we do our disabilities, or as much time, like we would at the back of a playing card, like attributes, maybe then we might dislike ourselves a little bit less, and maybe find more pride in the ways that we are more than proficient. Hell, we might even learn to enjoy ourselves. How can we enjoy ourselves if we are always so focused in what is wrong? If I have learned anything from these past few years, it is that there's no such thing as normal. As we go forward in this book, we go through it chronologically as I wrote it, but you can feel free to jump around to individual chapters because the book was meant to be read or listened to in order, but either way is fine. I have cited all of the videos, books, and blogs so that you can explore them as you see fit. After I record the audiobook and get this published, my goal is to read this book aloud on YouTube for Autism Awareness Month this April, which we're doing now. Whether I get paid or not for this book is inconsequential. What means the world to me is that you find the healing that you need. I may be a little bit of a weirdo, but I encourage you to jump in with me to this ride. Abandon normal, embrace the weird. We all have our gifts and our deficiencies. It doesn't make us deficient or defunct, just different to have autism spectrum disorder. Different is okay. Different is wonderful. How boring life would be if we were all the same. I know that you may have been drifting out to sea for a long time, but the lighthouse is on, and I want to welcome you home. We shouldn't spend our whole lives feeling like we are drifting out at sea. So grab a blanket and sit down by the fire. You are not broken. You're exactly what you should be and exactly where you should be. No one may be coming to save you, and that's okay. Grab your cape. The time has come for you to save yourself. Let's dive deep into all the world's a stage, unmasking Asperger syndrome, or autism spectrum disorder, or high-functioning autism, or whatever it is they're calling it. I tend to be a little long-winded. Thank you guys for watching. Hey, David Serpa, awesome. Thank you, Nancy. Greg McDonald, this is what I was telling you about. Feel free to watch this from the beginning. The book is now available on Amazon. The Audible will be available very soon. Love this, David Serpa. Thank you for the love, Kristen. Feel free to share this out. I will be doing this all month, reading my whole book about autism spectrum disorder or Asperger syndrome, and sharing this to YouTube as well as my business page. Overcomers like you, David, encourage me so much. Thank you for your transparency. Thank the Lord for neuroplasticity. Love the book. Your mind is what your brain does for a living. Help me understand my relationships close to me and become an advocate for those on the spectrum of autism. I appreciate you guys tuning in so much. Feel free to follow this story live on my personal Facebook page or tune into it recorded on my business page and on my YouTube channel. Please feel free to hit subscribe and follow and share this story out. And I will be reading, hopefully reading a chapter a day. You guys have a great day. And celebrate.